thank you all for coming, for your good hearts, good minds, and good intentions. It's good to live and work and play on the settled, soiled but still sacred lands and waters of the Coast Salish nations. We owe them a debt of gratitude that we can never repay. Gratitude, generosity, compassion are the roots of relationship, but gratitude has no place in resource management or environmental review. And that is strange. The project that this film came out of grew out of my research, my PhD research, where I was not trying to measure the immeasurable, but to demonstrate that the immeasurable mattered to a surprising cross-section of people, and for those reasons needed to be represented as clearly and cogently in environmental review and ecosystem-based management as the stuff that you can measure, much of which all of you deal with. And this is borne out in the ecological economics and ecosystem services literature. Many papers, including one by my friend Rashid, say things like, there are some, there are those, there are many, for whom the intangible, the immeasurable, is as or more important than the stuff that you can measure. But then there's a however. Spiritual values are notoriously difficult or impossible to measure. Religious values are controversial or inappropriate in a pluralistic society. And anyway, what we want to do is influence decision-making, and they respond to changes in money, so we're going to translate everything into dollar values. At that point, say no. At that point, it's time to bring in the people who are fluent in the stuff that you can't measure. So the project, the Pipelines and Poetics in Place project, looked at how one might open a review panel to receive and convey the immeasurable, clearly and cogently, what Aboriginal and religious ceremony and theatre, how they could make processes that are safer and more welcoming and attentive to all countries, and what additional modes of communication, be it film, dance, theatre, poetry, is it going to take to convey the implications of these projects to everybody, regardless of age, education, culture, and so forth. And in the federal light, the current federal court decision, it becomes even more important to see how you could pressure a renewed panel to incorporate some of the stuff that it currently leaves out. Thank you. As tar sands, the Alberta bitumen deposits are a vector for protest. As oil sands, they are hailed as vital to Canada's national interest. Environmental review of the Enbridge Northern Gateway and Kinder Morgan pipeline and tanker proposals to ship bitumen to offshore markets attract an incredible outpouring of passion and creativity. What we were wondering is what is lost in the translation between everything that is expressed around the pipelines and what makes it into the reports and the recommendations.
The kind of conversations that Indigenous folks are having versus the kind of conversations that Canada is having with Indigenous people, right? What are the ceremonies that Canada is trying to have? Maybe this environmental assessment process, how do I understand it as a white Western ceremony? Because actually we are all fundamentally changed by coming into contact with that assessment process.
We're looking at ceremony as a threat. So in terms of the environmental review, because people feel threatened, they feel overpowered by it, and they're fearful of the results of it and of their powerlessness to influence it, no matter how much they say or no matter how passionate they are.
say thank you to everyone that's here today, and welcome to all of you, as our ancestor Capilano had done in the past when he greeted the Spanish Captain Narvaez and the English Captain George Vancouver. And as he had done in the past, I raise my hands in welcome to all of you here on the traditional, ancestral, unceded lands of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people, on the lands that we share with our relatives from Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh.
You were told no need to kick down doors. You were being handed keys. What changed? Were you heard? No. What happened was that those who held the power and prestige simply went underground, found new doors to hide behind, sat quietly and listened politely, nodded heads, feigned acquiescence, and then walked opposite, stealthily away, did what they had always done, and called you crazy for not understanding process or procedure. Those who were always in power and the tokens they have co-opted would keep you silenced.
Aboriginal people are allowed to talk about spiritual matters. Unfortunately, that's all they're allowed to talk about. So the form of censorship is, we can trot you out, do your little song and dance, say your little prayer, and now get along, now the big boys are going to play. So that whole concept of power and how censorship is used by saying you are allowed to participate in creating knowledge. The only thing is you're window dressing so we can validate that we actually connected with an Aboriginal person. And it gets to be this whole thing about those poor Indians, look what happened to them. And that doesn't do anybody one whit of good.
We speak, letting the language find our lips. We speak, letting the language find our lips. We speak, and the world comes alive. We speak, and the world comes alive.
My name is Damien Timothy Christopher Gillis, and I grew up in unceded Kwakwaka'wakw territory in Campbell River.
Je m'appelle Angèle Beausoleil, Angèle Marie Beausoleil.
My full name is Lenora Angeles Calderon Angeles.
Her name Savannah, I found out, comes from the Taino word of savanna, for like the rolling grasslands.
When they were in New Zealand, and after a big coastal storm, all the other trees had been blown down, and the little shrubby, sturdy Nio trees were still standing, and so that's how they chose my name.
My name in Kwakwaka'wakw is Quisalach, which means woman who travels far.
Manuel Antonio Pina Balduquin.
My name translated is Neve, daughter of the Kelly chap.
Then I turned 13 and my grandmother gave me the name Ezekta.
This is a special place, space, sacred, spiritual. And so by intention, we need to agree every time we get together that that's what it is. Because if we can do that, we can begin to hear each other better, listen, talk more freely, open, honest, and really feel that we're contributing to something greater than just ourselves. And so it's important to, by whatever means, use ceremony, song, dance, other things to create that space.
All my relations come, every nation come. All my relations under the sun, we are one. We are praying, come. We are praying, come. We are the song and we are the drum. We are one.
Spirituality isn't something in and of itself. It's part of everything that we're doing. Mm-hmm. Spirituality is part of rational thought. Spirituality is part of our empathy and emotions that we share. Spirituality is part of who we are historically. Spirituality is a part of inclusiveness.
You might think of spirit as the flow of water and nutrients from bedrock through the tiny little roots of a tree, thickening into indigenous lifeways, religions, natural science, social science, philosophy, art, human endeavor, coming together in the trunk as the conversation we're starting to have here, branching into directions, some of which we may imagine and more of which we can't. This gives us a way to welcome and acknowledge different ways of being in the world without privileging any one of them over another.
I'm very attached to trees because when I was a kid, we just go hunting in the forest. And then when I was in the university, that turned me into an activist because there will be no even single tree in the community. That's how the illegal logging doing it. And now it's not about illegal logging the issue. It's more on mining companies destroying the land of my tribal people.
The downtown east side is a fantastic place. There's so much innovation happening here. The resilience of the people, you know, that they manage to still have a hope, you know, and they do from day to day.
Some people down here have fought long and hard for their access to water, for crab park, for their guerrilla gardens, for their spaces, for their food, for their medicinal plants.
Directing questions to you people living on the downtown east side, rather than kind of what are we as human beings facing or dealing with. And I feel that that's one of the challenges of living in the downtown east side, is when people come and it's kind of like singling out, or kind of like it has a kind of paternalizing or labeling feeling.
How do we deal with it? How do we connect the issues of an area where a lot of people are just concerned with where they're going to get the next meal, where they're going to sleep tonight? How is the pipeline? How is the attitude that the different governments and the big companies are taking, and big unions for that matter, taking when it comes to these types of projects? You're talking about big money, but that big money never gets translated into helping out the downtown east side.
No.
That's always bothered me about these governments, is that they talk about jobs and they talk about these big energy projects as revenue makers and as essential to the province, but where's the trickle down? How can you brag that we have such the best economy in Canada when you take a walk around this neighborhood or you listen to people's stories all over about housing and how they can't even make ends meet? That to me is not a wealthy society.
Because what you're talking about right now, is that ever emphasized? But whereas if you can show the people and, you know, leave the environmental issue, I'm not saying completely off the table, but go at it on what the actual case where it's going to affect. How's it going to affect the average Joe?
Adults are always caught up with the immediate business of living, particularly when they're living on the edge. But the ones who have the balanced input are the elders and the children.
You know, thank God there's still that sort of thing, that parents will still listen to their kids if they're kids, and they will heart. They will listen to the kids, but they won't listen to what the news is telling them. But if their kids are coming to them, or they're sitting around a dinner table, or just, you know, playing the video game, and they say, "Hey, Dad," because I know myself, if I hear the word environmental or environmentalist, is the first thing, it's another environmentalist, is going to be the general concern.
I'm no more into that kind of environmental thing for my tribe. It's about survival, because most of the people protesting about how to save the environment, they are just dying. Most of the activists are killed. So I'm not comfortable talking about how to make this community or this forest or this community beautiful, whereas these people are dying.
If we think about the large-scale watershed that we're in, that's kind of where that's how we're connected on a large scale. When we organize ourselves along the lines of the rivers and the watersheds, that gives us, I think, the tools that we need to understand the literacies that we need to be actually paying attention to. What's happening to these rivers?
The rivers hold many stories of love and loss, stories of survival, spirituality, tradition, industry, development, and the carving of new paths and times of abundance and scarcity. Making the intentional choice to listen to them, we open to ourselves the possibility of learning from them about each other and the natural world.
Here, in the now, we are not going, just going with the flow. We will flow where the river wants us to go. Grandma, river, take us where we should go.
I'd love to present this poetry to scientists and see. But the other part of me is saying, no, what you have to do is collect really hard data. I'd like to be able to come up with alternative metaphors.
Scientists understand the nature of storytelling better than most of us, for they tell us stories about very small things like atoms that they've never seen, or happenings that are not happening now but took place a very long time ago, and persuade us to believe them.
Whether we call them myths, whether we call them computer models, whether they're equations, whether they're parables, whether they're maps, are ways to point to more complex levels of reality. So these metaphors are not mutually contradictory, they're enriching true story. Which is it?
I'm a linguist, and I've come to see language as a type of archive that records the thousands of years of relationship between people and place. Every place in this continent had a name and multiple names. Every place was in a relationship with the people who lived there and cared for it.
I see our language as being the identity that defines who I am, who we are. Place names in my territory were given names in our language by my ancestors. A final example comes from the name Tenki, a part of the river in Hoyt. This word means to vibrate or to tremble, in reference to the amount of fish that were in the creek. When I get these translations and these little stories from someone like my grandfather, who actually stood there and felt the ground move and heard the fish in so great numbers flap their tail, to see the expression on his face adds a lot to that. Because I've never seen that in my life. Because if a spill does happen, the physical features of these places are going to change so much that we're going to be forced to change the names of these places because my language is so descriptive. It is unfathomable to comprehend this even happening. It is inevitable that cultures change over time, but these changes happen slowly. This would not be a small, slow change, an oil spill. This would be a catastrophic change for my people in the way that we speak our language, and it would change the way we teach the language to the new generations, all because of money.
What kind of people have we become? We have to shift our values and realize that there's something more important than money and the monetary system that's been enforced on us, that in my judgment is immoral, corrupt, and unjust.
A great principle that exists within the Hitchcock potlatch system that separates my culture from many others around the world is that you are not rich because of what you own, you're rich for what you give away to your people. This Northern Gateway project isn't about creating anything good or giving anything away for the benefit of the people. It is about the money and how many billions of dollars Enbridge will make, and this goes completely against the grain of what my people believe in.
The organization that run these talks is the National Energy Board, and their business is to secure a supply of energy for Canadians. So you could ask yourself, in what moral universe is the National Energy Board the proper agency to decide on the future?
Oftentimes these processes are about a battle over passion versus dispassion, control. And so it's people of the public trying to infuse the process with passion. And the proponent and the government, the regulator, their job is almost to suck all of the life and the passion out of the process, to make it as dry and boring and clinical and packaged and boxed as possible.
The last thing that anybody wants in these processes is passion.
There are very, very narrow confines within which you're allowed to comment. For instance, the Enbridge pipeline review, we're not allowed to, and Kinder Morgan, we're not allowed to talk about climate change. We're not allowed to talk about the tar sands and where the oil was going to come from. You weren't allowed to talk about the economics unless they were sort of the very narrowly defined economics of what is accepted around the pipeline and what value it brings to our economy.
The advisory committee had recommended the wording that you see on the screen with societal, economic, spiritual, and cultural connections to the marine ecosystem. And when it was sent up to government, they took out the spiritual and sent it back to us. We were able to quiz the government and have them explain to us and say we didn't like the explanation, so we put the word back in it and sent it back up. And this happened a couple of times until they realized that we weren't changing our mind and identified that this spiritual connection with the marine ecosystem is very important, and it's not something that we're going to give up.
If you are lucky enough to define the things you care about with the ocean, you know the values, the next thing is how do you really carry out the valuation? Because it's not a given, it's not trivial at all. So I care about spiritual values. How do I value them? That is another big challenge.
Rashid and I have worked on 2 big projects looking at the potential economic impact of tanker spills. But at the point where we developed the proposal to do this research, there is a constraint, right? There's the constraint in terms of how much money and time do we have to do this? And that was where the first major narrowing down happened, is we have enough money to use existing data. So we narrowed it down to things like tourism and commercial fishing, and but that took this huge set of values and narrowed it down to a handful.
Well, economic viability is in the literature, when you really look into it, they're just looking at the money. Like the argument is that, especially in coastal-based community fisheries, it's not just about making money. It is about tradition. It is could be about food security. It could be about social dynamics, and there's a lot more to it, right?
When the people who look at valuing ecosystem services, the ecologists and economists have found this work transformative, but they keep expressing their results in dollar equivalents, even though they hasten to add that these things are not for sale. But we're using dollars because spiritual values or spiritual dimensions are difficult to measure, if not impossible. Religious values are controversial or inappropriate in a pluralistic society. What we really want to do is influence decision-making, and decision-making respond to changes in dollar values.
In
In terms of creating safe space, we also have to acknowledge not only do we come from different perspectives, but we are also part of a society that is principally gendered and racialized. And we need to be open to reflect on our own complicity.
I think,
you know, if I was following and practicing ceremony, the idea is that we live within realms of existence and reality, and they're all intermingling and commingling at the same time. And some folks are able to actually see those realms, right? And so the ceremony, beginning, middle, and end, is a lifting up for one person of those sort of blinders between those realms of existence. But at the same time, somebody needs to guide that process, right? And in thinking about and structuring safety, even though there is no space, there is no safe space, somebody needs to take on all of that particular energy. And that's what influences a safer space.
I have this term that you'll probably love, Peter, called ceremonial activism. And it's like creating positive change through intention. So taking ceremony and making it create change. It was 13 years of people from all over the world coming to help save my people's forest. How humbling is that? How is it done? Through actively practicing ceremony on the land and involving people from many cultures.
I've been in situations in which people make themselves vulnerable. And what allows me to go there is because somebody can hold the space. Somebody is leading, and I trust the leader.
For those of us who are traditional practitioners of ceremony, it seems to take an awful lot of courage to step in. And you build up to that courage. And you build up slowly through small steps over time. And I think that's what it takes to be a performing artist who's engaged deeply with the politics of who they are and the time they're in.
Somehow around the ceremony of eating and sharing food, we might relax anyway or be nourished, but that was a really generative process, breaking bread. And it led to a whole discussion around culture and origin and well-being and sense of self and all the things that I find we don't talk about in a properly academic environment.
There is a wonder at the heart of storytelling and at the heart of knowledge. And what I call a covenant of wonder is at the heart of our relationship with the material and the spiritual world. We can't choose between wonder and wondering. And we can't separate thought and feeling.
Have we forgot so much about the wonder of it all, the mystery of it all, that we got to be tuned in exactly and resolve things the way we want to resolve it? Or have we lost the ability to comprehend or try to comprehend those things that we cannot?
The sense of wonder that you mentioned resonates quite significantly because I teach kids about the ocean and about fish every day, but it's not just salmon. It would be sea anemones and nudibranchs and all of these crazy. So there are all these. Like every day I go into work and I'm totally blown away by this random fact about some marine mammals. It's an incredible alternative way of being in the world that I think would be a devastating loss.
What we need to do is to empower ourselves and to say to the world, to others, we all have a voice. Hear me, see me. We're together. And we should be finding ways to make decisions that allow all of us to be comfortable that we're protecting those things that need protection and that the integrity of the environment will sustain itself through time. And the only way we're going to get to breaking down those things that have created the divisions is to create those safe spaces and places, create the protocols that allow you to have the discussion.
To expand the perceptual scope of a review process, you would need to include people who speak for Indigenous spiritual values, beliefs, and commitments, people who speak for the citizens who are spiritual and non-religious, people who speak for eco-theology, eco-feminist theology, who look at our relationship to the planet as something that is a responsibility as well as a right. We need the artists, we need the poets, the painters, the musicians, the filmmakers to communicate to us these deep feelings of connection and commitment in ways that the technocratic, the scientific language of the current reports and recommendations cannot.
I grew up with old people in my life, and they always talked about a time when we could still converse with the animals. They always talked about a time when everything was interrelated, tools that we can use to affirm our interconnectedness, to determine what it is as a common cause that we should all be a part of, that our economy and our environment and families and communities and our politics and everything else is separate from each other. No, it's not. It's all interrelated. And this time, it's different, if we allow it to be different. It's about us saying to each other, how do we do it together? And you're going to need each other to change these energy review panels and forums that decide the fate of this divine place that we call Mother Earth. So how can we do it? It'll be together.
It is our nature to find truth. The truth is, we all need each other. If we are to survive, we need each other. We're part of a bigger thing now. It isn't a First Nations thing. Again, I call on all of my fellow men to open your hearts and understand that we may come together and be as one and be good people together, heal together to find our path to righteousness. That's all I ask.
We are standing strong, like a rock, like a stone. On the sacred ground we belong, we are home. Mini Wachoni sing, Mini Wachoni sing, Mini Wachoni, water is life for everything. We are the water, sing. We are the water, sing. We are the water, we are where all life begins. All my relations come, every nation come. All my relations under the sun, we are one.
Well, we tried to get the movie out there. We haven't had a tremendous amount of success, but I really want to push on that now, and I'm working with my friend Stephen Tabernacle will be to put together a second stage of the project. But also, there are a lot of good people who participated in this project, some of whom you've seen, some of whom you haven't, and I think I really want to see if we can put pressure on this next set of hearings that's going to come out of the federal court decision to totally reconstitute those panels, because they exclude the spiritual or underrepresented, and they only take a really narrow slice of the measurable, as you saw from some of your colleagues and friends there. So that's to do. Not a great response. Anybody's got some ideas or anybody wants me to show it to anybody, I will happily do that. of the strange things about the spiritual is Indigenous people are regarded as spiritual because, and they're welcome into the halls of academia, of politics, of industry, but they're not allowed to practice in those things because spirituality doesn't belong. And what we have is an over-interpretation or misinterpretation of the separation of religion and politics, which is never intended to keep the insights of indigenous spiritual traditions and religions and philosophy out of the public square, but is used very effectively to do that. I've been worked in these four walls for many years, and as soon as you talk about spirituality or religion, you immediately get an invocation of Pope Dawkins and a lot of withering scorn. And yet, science, fisheries science, environmental science is a spiritual practice. It's a practice of attention, of socialization and attunement to everything that is going on beyond, around you. Science is a faith-based practice. It's based in faith in yourself, in your colleagues. And if you put your heart and your mind and your soul and your strength into your search, that you will find what you were looking for, or you will not, but that you will learn. Sorry, I'm making another speech. Is there a question? I haven't, but it's interesting because spiritual beliefs, dimensions are not strange or fascinating aspects of other cultures. All cultures are manifestations of spirit. And this culture is increasingly a manifestation of the cannibal spirit, which you will see in West Coast training of chiefs that they have to learn to curb, so that they will not consume resources for themselves, but will distribute them. There's a similar Irish tradition. So Indigenous people are, as I say, they have that reputation for spirituality, but I maintain it's a form of racial stereotyping, that they're no more spiritual than anybody else, but that in Indigenous society, it's perfectly acceptable to speak about the spiritual and everyday matters, whereas within these four walls, we don't do that. I've been in many things on salmon farming when an Indigenous person will stand up and say, it's a spiritual matter, and immediately after people will pop up left, right, and center saying, yes, she's right. It is a spiritual matter, but until that Aboriginal person gave them the social license to do it, they would not express their own spiritual connection. They were uncomfortable because for us, it's private. You start talking about spirituality, about religion, it makes people deeply uncomfortable. And that's wrong. I find the same discomfort in your religion's a private matter. That's between you and your God or goddess or church or place of business. It's not something you bring into your work. About 6 months ago, I was having breakfast with Bobby Joe, Chief Robert Joseph, and he said, you'll never guess where I'm going next night. I said, tell me. He said he was going down to the Vancouver Club to speak to the Ayatollahs of all the mining companies in British Columbia. So I said, well, consider trying this on them. Ask them to consider how it is that it's only as an Indigenous person that he would be invited into their company to discuss spiritual and other matters. Whereas as a spiritual person, he would not be invited into their work. Whereas they, who doubtless have spiritual relationships with their own sacred spaces, with animals, creatures, with their pets, possibly even with their cars, are not allowed to bring that into their work. So there's a double cognitive or epistemic injustice, whereas those who may speak may not practice, and those who may practice may not speak. And that is a serious cognitive injustice and a dismal failure of democracy, and that's why we need to overhaul not just these panels. You know, Pope Francis put an incredible encyclical into the Paris climate discussions. What he didn't do was call for people who speak for the spiritual matters on the Intergovernmental Panel. And that's why I say we need to bring these things back into the work, because The spiritual people, the religious people, the artists are furiously articulate in the critique of what's going on. That's not enough. To a very limited extent, there's quite a lot of poetry in this project. This is a distillate of 4 days, but nowhere near as much as I'd like. I mean, this is sort of like the beginning of something, I think, because there's no problem with language. We're all fluent in the language of love and relationship in some aspect of our lives. It's just this wall that keeps the language of relationship out of the language of measurement, and that wall has been hundreds of years in the building, and all we can do is help people climb over it in both directions. And that's really what this is about. But I think that the failure to exclude and the underrepresentation of the quantifiable should be grounds for challenge to past, present, and future process under Indigenous and Canadian law. But I have not yet been able to engage the legal community in that. Thank you. That's an interesting question. Yes, there are a lot of religious groups or religious people who are getting themselves arrested and protesting. You saw my friend Barry Morris being hauled off by a couple of RCMP peeps in that. But the princes and princesses of the church are standing back from that. And I was speaking to Bishop Melissa, the Anglican Bishop of Vancouver, about a year ago, and said, you guys have really got to stop using Indigenous people as human shields, pushing them out in front of you, because you will not speak to your own spiritual connection to this place. And Indigenous people are by far the oldest and wisest people with a spiritual connection to this place. But that, I don't think, we'll talk qualitative, I think it may be quantitatively different from yours and mine, but I don't think it's qualitatively different. And I think that it's time for the religious leaders to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Indigenous people and stop pushing them ahead of them, because they can't do this on their own.